Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 10, about media and politics. This is Lesson 10, about press attitudes. In the previous lesson, we learned about the various eras that the American press has passed through. In this lesson, we're going to focus on the attitudes of the current press corps of the United States. Now, in saying that, I realize that there's a bit of terminology that I took for granted in previous lessons that I probably shouldn't have. And that is this use of the term press. In the beginning of this unit, I talked about the mass media. The mass media refers to all those various forms of communication that are used to reach people across vast audiences. The people who actually engage in doing that are generally either called by the name the media, although that can refer to the organizations as well as the people involved, or the individual people are called journalists, that's a term that's sometimes used, or they are called the press also. Now, the press also can refer to organizations that actually engage in print media, mostly newspapers. This goes back to the idea of a printing press. So the people who were involved in the creation of these printed documents for mass circulation, like newspapers, were called the press. Well, these terms are used interchangeably a lot in a modern American discussions of the mass media. Whether you say the media, or whether you talk about the press, or whether you talk about journalists, whichever term you're using, mostly what's being talked about is the people that are involved in this sort of business. Particularly in a course about American government, we're talking about the people who are reporting on the government. So whether I say journalists, or whether I say press, or whether I say media, I'm really talking about the same thing. And I apologize that I didn't make all that clear beforehand. As I said, now the definitions may be slightly different if you get technical about it. The media is referring to all these organizations, whether it be television or radio or newspaper, that as collective organizations, not individual people. The press could be referring to collective organizations that are involved in print media. But in general, when we talk about media, press, and journalists, we're referring to the same thing. We're talking about the people that are involved in reporting in these places. Okay, now we got that terminology out of the way, and I'm sure that you understand. Let's now move on to this lesson 10 about the attitudes of the modern press. In this lesson, you'll learn about muckraking, you'll learn about the Watergate scandal, you'll learn about investigative journalism, about the fourth branch of government, about advocacy journalism, and about adversarial journalism. So let me begin by referring you back to, in the previous lesson, where we talked about the era of the partisan press. Remember, that was a time period in which the mass media sources, newspapers, were blatantly in favor of one political party or another. In fact, they were often started by one political party or another. But then came along changes in American society. Urbanization, in other words, the rise of big cities. Industrialization. We became a mechanized culture with giant industrial complexes that were making all kinds of things, including the mass media, such as newspapers. Well, these sorts of things came along and put new economic pressures on the business of the mass media. And in response to that, it changed to become what became known as the objective press, where you would have these giant media organizations that would at least try to appeal to everybody by no longer saying, oh, we favor one political party or another, but instead claiming that they were just giving us the objective, neutral, down-the-middle truth of things. The objective press was around for about a century. Matter of fact, there's people who still claim it exists today. And some examples of it that we talked about in the previous lesson are the big television networks that came into being. But now let's go into a little more detail about this. At the beginning of the era of the objective press, there was a particular political movement that contributed to the creation of it. That was the progressive movement. The progressive era lasted from about 1890 to about 1920. Now, as I said in the previous lesson, when I give you these dates, they're not exact things on a calendar. It's to give you an idea of the general time period. Somebody else might say that the progressive era started in 1886 or something like that. It doesn't matter. From around 1890 to about 1920. Now, the progressive era was an era in American politics when politicians started talking about using the power of government to correct social problems. And during this time period, both major political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, embraced this general view of government power. Now, this is important for the end of the partisan press, because once the two political parties basically have the same point of view, then it is not as valuable for the press to be arguing about the two parties with each other. I mean, they're basically saying the same thing. Where's the conflict and controversy in that to gain viewers? To gain readers. They didn't have viewers yet. There isn't a lot. And so the press turned elsewhere to look for the enemies that they were going to attack to try to get readers interested and to try to raise money. Now, during this time period, one of the presidents of the United States was Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt. He was a Republican and he was a progressive. And so he would go around and give speeches about the necessity of using the power of government to get rid of the ills of society. Well, he thought others should participate in getting rid of the ills of society also. And here's an example of a speech where he talked about the man with the muckrake. Well, who is the man with the muckrake? It's an allusion to someone described in a book called Pilgrim's Progress, about a man who is so intent on scraping up the trash off the floor, essentially, that he can't look up and see other things in life. And what Teddy Roosevelt argued was that, well, you know what? There is muck on the floor, and it does need to be scraped up. And sometimes the person with the muck rake trying to clean things up is performing an important service to everybody. And so he thought that people should be actively engaged in trying to clean up the ills of society, including the press. He talks about that he would hail every writer, every speaker who mercilessly attacks those who are contributing to the evils, the social ills of society. So essentially he was giving a green light to the media to attack the people that he considered to be the ones who were contributing to the filth of society. Well, from this speech, we gained the term muckraking, which refers to not just politicians like himself, but also members of the media who engage in trying to clean up society. So, what we then have was this era in the progressive time period in which members of the media who engaged in newspaper reporting that was intent on cleaning up social ills were called muckrakers. But the muckraking period eventually declined and effectively disappeared. And the reason was because, first of all, in the 1920s, newspapers began to buy up other newspapers, corporations bought up the newspapers, and you ended up with these huge conglomerates who were trying to reach vast audiences and didn't really want to be in the business of offending this particular company or that particular organization by claiming that they were doing things that were bad for society. They thought it might hurt the selling of newspapers. Then what came along was these causes that united America. First the Great Depression and then World War II. We're pointing out what was wrong with America, as the muckrakers didn't seem to be the right thing to say and do to get people to want to read your newspapers or eventually listen to your radio show, watch your television show, etc. So we entered a period, the middle of this objective journalism period, in which the mass media really tried to say nice things about the government and about the country as a whole. When they would report on what the government was doing, they would simply tell you what the government said. Oh, the government held a press conference. This is what they said in it. Oh, the government released a press release. This is what they said in it. This is what the politicians said in this speech, etc. They weren't really trying to dig around for the evil, bad things behind what was being said. They just repeated what was said. Now, that began to change, and the idea of muckraking kind of came back in the 1970s. Really kind of began in the 1960s during the era of Vietnam and the protest movement, that sort of thing. But it really had a rebirth with the Watergate scandal. Now, this is something we've mentioned in this course before. Richard Nixon was president. He was running for re-election in 1972. Some members of his campaign broke into the headquarters of his opponent, looking for what their secret battle plans were, so to speak. They got caught. At first, nobody knew who these people were or why they were there. They had no idea they were connected to the Nixon campaign. Nixon tried to cover up the connection, which he managed to do until he was reelected. But eventually we found out what happened. Well, there was a particular reason why we found out what happened, which then led to President Nixon resigning. That reason was that a couple of reporters at the Washington Post named Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward dug and dug and dug to reveal what had happened. This was a sort of a rebirth of muckraking when they did this, and had such tremendous success. At first, no one believed what they were hunting down. They had to use some questionable means to track down the story, but in the end, they were right. They ended up revealing the connection between President Nixon and this break-in. The president ended up having to resign from office as a result. It was a profound moment for American journalism when they did this. It was such a profound moment that it became the story for modern journalists. A movie was made about it, starring Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman, who those names may not mean anything to you, but they were a couple of the biggest stars of the time. The book that was written about them and the movie that portrayed them, it showed them as David fighting against Goliath. The press was the hero. The journalists were the heroes that saved America from a rotten president. Well, that myth of heroism that was displayed in Woodward and Bernstein tracking down the Watergate scandal became the myth that attracted people to journalism then. People who were activists and reformers who wanted to attack what they saw as bad government or bad corporations or whatever, they then went into journalism in droves to try to become like Woodward and Bernstein. They wanted to be the heroes that transformed society. Well, as a result of that, journalism changed. And we're going to look now at 4 aspects of post-Watergate journalism. The first of those is the press, the media, journalists, seeing themselves as the 4th branch of government. What do we mean by that? Well, what we mean is that the journalists believed that they had an obligation now to stand up against the government. Here's a quote from somebody in the media describing the journalists as a 4th branch of government, describing them as having an adversarial function, to question those in the other branches. Now, remember, back way earlier in this course when we talked about the 3 branches of government and the checks and balances that exist between them, the idea that we got from James Madison was that those 3 branches were supposed to stand up against each other to prevent each other from becoming more powerful than they were supposed to be. Well, when the journalists looked at the Watergate scandal and things like that, they said, hey, we have a function in this too. We are supposed to be standing up against the government. So, the news media in modern times now sees their role as not just telling the public about what the government is doing, but to actually stand up against the government and check its power. And not just the government. They see themselves as having this role with big businesses and things like that too. The second development that we get in journalism post-Watergate is the idea of investigative journalism. of journalists digging around behind the scenes to find out what they think is really happening, rather than just accepting the official point of view. This is the muckraking of the 1910s back in the 1970s, but we just now call it investigative journalism. So investigative journalism involves reporters trying to search behind the scenes, go to other sources, to try to find out what they believe the government is actually doing, rather than just accepting what the government's word is. And as I said before, this applies to them looking behind the scenes of other big organizations too, such as corporations, not just the government. Investigative journalists now oftentimes do this through using anonymous sources. This is where they say, oh, somebody told me this, but I can't tell you who they are, which at one time period was considered a bad thing for journalism to do. Because the problem with anonymous sources is, how do you know if the anonymous source is telling the truth if you don't even know who this person is to go check on them to see if they would have any reason to know what they claim they're knowing? Now, these anonymous sources oftentimes talk to the journalists through tips and leaks. This is where they may call up somebody and say, hey, I heard about something that's going on, or here's this document that you're not supposed to have, but I'm going to send it to you anyway. So there's people in government, in corporations, that for one reason or another want to blow the whistle on their own organization and tell journalists what's going on in there that they think is bad. But at the same time, they don't want to get fired from their job for doing it, so they'll say, okay, I'm going to pass this document on to you that you shouldn't have, telling you about the bad things we're doing, but shh, don't tell anybody who I am. Now, an example of this sort of anonymous source tip leak thing can be seen in the background photo here on this slide. There was a man named Edward Snowden who worked for the National Security Agency. This agency essentially listens to what everybody else is talking about around the world to try to compile information that then we can use as a country to know how we should respond to what's going on. Well, Snowden, who was working for them, found out that this agency was listening to Americans too, recording our telephone conversations, capturing every one of our emails, putting these all in a giant database that then was scanned by computer programs to look for terrorist activity. Essentially, the government was listening to every one of your phone calls and reading every one of your emails. Now, the people in the government say, we weren't actually reading your emails, it was a computer program that was doing it. And they would only kick something out for us to look at if there was some sort of suspicion you were a terrorist. But nonetheless, they were collecting all this data. And this scared Snowden. He thought, oh my gosh, the government shouldn't be collecting all our information like this, all our conversations. And so he leaked this to the media. Now he's in hiding, living in Russia, so he doesn't get arrested and thrown in prison by the United States government for leaking their information to the public. But this is an example of the kind of thing that happens in modern investigative journalism. A third thing that developed post-Watergate was the idea of advocacy journalism. Now, what we mean by advocacy journalism is that people in the media would see things, causes out there, in which there is somebody who needs to be defended or assisted. Somebody that the reporters can use their power to help out. Here we have a quote from the New York Times ombudsman. An ombudsman is a person who works for an organization who's supposed to be pointing out to that organization what they're doing wrong. In this case, it's somebody working for the New York Times in 2012 who pointed out to the New York Times that certain issues, for example, the issue of gay marriage, that the New York Times didn't seem to be neutral at all, but seemed to be treating it as a cause, and something that they were advocating for rather than merely reporting upon. This is something that's developed in the post-Watergate era, that journalists, the media, the press, they take up causes in which they advocate for one side that they feel like needs their help. So advocacy journalism involves reporters using their influence to defend or assist somebody in some sort of political or social controversy. For the example, effectively being on the side of legalizing same-sex marriage during that struggle. A final development in post-Watergate journalism is the idea of adversarial journalism. Adversarial journalism is when the media uses its power to expose in some way what somebody is doing. to try to uncover what they consider to be falsehoods. They feel an obligation to stand up and point out what somebody else is doing wrong. This is oftentimes done through what is called gotcha journalism, where the media goes in, say they're going to have an interview with somebody, and they suddenly bring up an embarrassing, shocking line of questioning that the person wasn't prepared for, or ask them questions that there's no way that they would have been ready to answer. Like, for example, say there's a politician that the media wants to expose as being a dummy from their point of view. Oh, this person isn't educated enough, or this person isn't informed enough to be elected. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into that interview, I'm going to sit down and start talking to them, and suddenly I'm going to ask them questions about the specific names of people, or the capitals of countries, or particular laws that they had no idea I was going to talk about, no reason to prepare for, but they're going to sit there dumbfounded, and that's the way I'm going to be able to show that they're a dummy, so that people know that this person is a dummy. So in adversarial journalism, they're trying to point out somebody's flaws. Now, when the media engages in advocacy journalism and adversarial journalism, they're effectively taking sides. Rather than just being neutral reporters, they're choosing who's right and who's wrong. But to do that, they've got to decide who the victim is. And they've got to decide who the villain is. Well, how do they do that? Well, in modern journalism, the way they do it revolves around this old quote. Now, this isn't the person who originally said it, but this is an example of a journalism. And I could give you dozens of examples of journalists saying the same thing. That their job is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. In other words, they feel it's their job to stick up for the little guy while attacking the big and the powerful. Now, this isn't neutral journalism anymore. And it may not even be the morally right position in a certain situation. I mean, there may be times when the big and powerful are the right. They're the ones that are being hurt by the little guy. Maybe times that the little guy is the jerk and the troublemaker. We don't know. But if journalists go in assuming that the little guy needs to be protected and the big and powerful need to be torn down, they are not really being objective journalists anymore. Instead, they are choosing sides. All right, let's review now what we learned in this lesson. What is muckraking known as today? Is it adversarial journalism, advocacy journalism, investigative journalism, or patriotic journalism? Muckraking is known today as investigative journalism, where they're trying to dig around and expose the ills of society. What is a modern example of muckraking? Is it a presidential press conference? Is it a corporate press release? Is it moderating a candidate debate? Or is it the Watergate scandal? An example of modern muckraking is the Watergate scandal. Now, the other three possibilities here are all situations where the press is not digging around. Instead, they're just taking what somebody says. Watergate is an example of them saying, we're not going to accept the official line. Instead, we're going to dig around and try to find out what we thought, what really happened. What is meant by the media being a fourth branch? Does it mean that they check government power? That people have a right to know? That the press receive government funds? Or that they cooperate with Congress? When we say the press is a fourth branch, we mean that they check government power. They stand up against government. What is a problem with advocacy and adversarial journalism? Is it that there's not enough controversy for them? Is it that the media chooses sides when they do this? Is it that it unites too many viewers? Or is it that it does not provide a check on power? The problem with advocacy and adversarial media is that they choose sides. They're deciding who is right and who is wrong before they ever present the material to their viewers or readers. All right, that completes this lesson. The next lesson will also be from Unit 10. It'll be Lesson 11 about the characteristics of the press.